John, thank you very much for that kind and generous introduction. It is a pleasure to be back in front of you today. I had the opportunity to visit for a few minutes yesterday at the general business session and bring you an update on sort of what's been going on at the commission and sort of big picture. And today, Andres and the team asked me to speak for a few minutes about Georgia's forest sustainability and where we stand there, and that's an opportunity that I really do appreciate. For those of you that may be masters at PowerPoint, Wendy Burnett down here is our communications and PR manager, and we were fully prepared today for her to run the clicker. If you can believe it, in August I'll be 64 years old, and I have never run a PowerPoint presentation in my life. I will tell you this. Back last year, the Forest Landowners Association National Group was meeting at the Ritz-Carlton at Lake Oconee for their national meeting, and I was giving a welcome to the state of Georgia to that group. And there was when I got to the podium to do that, there was a laptop computer at the podium, and they had my mug shot up on the screen, sort of like this, to do the welcome. And I was sort of standing here like this, and I noticed nobody was looking at me. Everybody was looking at the screens, and unbeknownst to me, my sort of right wrist was laying on one of the arrow buttons on the laptop. And so I was scrolling through at a rapid pace all of the speaker bios and whatnot for the whole conference. So y'all bear with me. Anything may happen here. So Frank Bishop, here we go. We'll see what happens. The sustainability report is a document that we do periodically. You see a version of it, the cover of it there on the screen, and it is available on our website. If you're so interested in getting into the minutia, you can go to www.gatrees.org and download a copy. We have a few copies in our booth in the exhibit hall, but really our primary audience for this document is internal to state government, and it is to the governor and the General Assembly. Back in 2007, the General Assembly and the governor passed legislation that mandated that every 5 years the Georgia Forestry Commission, as you can read there, would verify the ability of forest resources in this state to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability to meet the needs of future generations. So we would like to think that this endeavor that we do every 5 years is something that we would hopefully be smart enough to be doing anyway, but certainly when the legislature and the governor says you shall do so, that is part of our mission. And I'm proud to say that as we speak, we're totally confident that as an industry, the state of Georgia and her forestry community are checking that box fully, if you will, on meeting that mandate. Just to recap some numbers, and a sustainability report cannot be done, I don't think, without getting into some numbers, but I know it's late in the day. As the speakers always say, I'm the last thing standing between you and the gentlemen going and putting on your tuxedos and the ladies putting on your evening gowns for the reception and dinner this evening. So I do appreciate y'all hanging in with us this afternoon for me to be able to share this with you. And again, try to keep it not too heavy on numbers, but we do need to touch on a few of them. 24 million acres in Georgia, that's 2/3 of our land area are in forest cover. 91% of that is privately owned. A diverse composition, as you can see, with a pretty close mix between softwood, hardwood, and then mixed stands, and a number that just to me sort of boggles the mind that statewide we're growing 2 tons of wood per second. And to me, that's a number that just sort of jumps out. More commercially available timberland than any other state in the nation, over 200 primary wood-using mills and over 1,000 secondary mills, $36 billion economic output, nearly 150,000 jobs, and almost $9 billion in wages. And then at the bottom of the screen there, something I want to point out that you may say, why are we even mentioning this at a conference of the Georgia Forestry Association? And that is the impact of urban and community forestry. if you think about it, Georgia's population is at 10 million, headed towards 11 million. About half of those live in the metro Atlanta area, and we saw a presentation earlier today about how that metro Atlanta area has grown and grown and grown over recent decades. And for a lot of Georgia's citizens and a lot of Georgia's taxpayers and a lot of Georgia's voters, that is their concept of forestry, is urban and community forestry. It's the neighborhoods they live in, it's the pocket parks that are in those neighborhoods, it's the Piedmont parks in towns like Atlanta. To them, what you and I may think of as forestry is just a blur out the side of the BMW when they're headed from Atlanta down to Sea Island. And for some of those constituents, I think it's very important if reaching them through urban and community forestry is how we reach them and garner their hopeful support and understanding of forestry, and hopefully their elected officials, representatives' support of forestry, urban and community is an area that we think is important for us to do that. Another factor that I know Dale Green, the folks at Warnell several years ago made a valiant effort to try to quantify the value of ecosystem services that forestry provides in Georgia. And the numbers that came out of that study was basically that the ecosystem services pretty much stand neck and neck with the direct economic impact. And we could probably talk through the reception and through the dinner tonight about exactly what should be and should not be included in ecosystem services, but I think we all would recognize that when you're talking about clean air, clean water, wildlife habitat, both game and non-game, that as I like to remind Mark Williams, who is no relation, a lot of you know Mark is the commissioner of the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, that for the most part, the critters and the fish that his agency manage live in our forest and our watersheds, if you will. And so from that standpoint, we're all in it together. And you see there the recreation numbers, just huge recreation numbers for spending on recreation, and with the action that the Georgia General Assembly took last year and then the voters took in November in passing the Georgia Outdoor Stewardship Act, now known as the Georgia Outdoor Stewardship Program, we're going to see a portion of the sales tax dollars that sportsmen and women spend on sporting goods allocated back to land acquisition and land conservation. I know that sometimes can be a ticklish subject in the private forestry sector, the state owning lands and increasing that land base. But again, on a state like Georgia where the population is changing and growing, I think that's in some ways a price that we have to pay as the private forestry sector, is to make sure that, again, if that's how we connect with that 10 plus million Georgians, that we're willing to do that. Water quality. When I was in the legislature, as John alluded to, my passion for service there was in the natural resource and environment arena. And one of the things that I was always looking for was a way to connect with legislators. You would think urban only, but oftentimes suburban and sometimes even rural legislators that did not understand really the dynamics of forestry and water and how it all ties together. And what I found was very effective in communicating with those legislators that were trying to piece the puzzle together was to tell them that if the entire state of Georgia is getting a rain, 2 out of every 3 of those raindrops that are falling in the state of Georgia are falling on forest land. And further, to tell those folks that basically are within the Metro Atlanta watershed and rely on Metro Atlanta for their drinking water, that if they went and had a frank conversation with the folks that run the Metro Atlanta water system, those water system operators would tell them that their job is made much easier by the fact that Metro Atlanta's watershed basically comes from a forested watershed from Atlanta north rather than from a developed urban watershed where the water, instead of hitting forest land, is hitting concrete and asphalt. And I found that was very effective, and I think that's something that we all can just need to sort of keep that in your hip pocket, if you will, if you have those opportunities to have conversations. with folks, whether they're policymakers or not. And one other thing there, this isn't a legislative talk, but one of the things that I guess I was a little surprised when I got to the legislature was sort of in the old days, you could look at a state legislator's hometown and pretty much know with good certainty whether they understood agriculture and forestry and natural resource issues. That's not the case necessarily these days, and what I mean by that, as I mentioned earlier, you may have a legislator from very deep rural Georgia who is there by virtue of a profession. Maybe he's an attorney or a doctor or a dentist that may be married into that community and has set up his or her practice there. Conversely, you may have a legislator in the metro Atlanta area, maybe inside 285, that has really embraced this thing about knowing where their food comes from, and they have taken it upon themselves to learn more about where food and fiber comes from. So I learned maybe a little bit the hard way after sort of embarrassing myself a couple of times, jumping to conclusions that the rural folks knew what we were talking about with forestry and the urban folks didn't, that is not necessarily the case. But you can see here again the numbers on water quality, and any of you that were at the board meeting yesterday heard the state EPD director really praise Georgia's forestry community for the work that we're doing collectively as an industry and a community there in maintaining water quality. And you heard him talk about that with EPD as a regulatory agency, they actually relish the thought that through our voluntary BMP programs that a lot of you in here are involved in, that we sort of take the pressure off of EPD on water quality by looking after our own house voluntarily rather than them having to do it through enforcement actions. You can see the numbers there. Just the stream quantities are huge. The forestry operations, we all know that those are around the state, and we're real proud that our evaluations show that we're remaining above 90% on BMP compliance. So we're not satisfied with that. We would like for that number to be higher, but again, if you think about it, if you walk into a restaurant and you look at that health score up on the wall and you see 93%, you're probably feeling pretty comfortable about that being a good, safe place to eat a meal, and that's somewhat the way we look at that. Always room for improvement, but we're proud of where we are. As I mentioned earlier, wildlife, there's always been a close tie between the forestry community and the wildlife community, if you will. But species at risk, the issue of endangered species and listing is something that we all have to be very cognizant of, very aware of. And we spend a lot of time at the Georgia Forestry Commission working with our partners in the defense sector, the Department of Defense, Army, certainly with the footprint that Fort Stewart and Fort Benning in particular have, other military bases, because that's in our best interest for a lot of reasons. Certainly the issue with the gopher tortoise, we are all aware of those issues, and if you think about it, Benning and Stewart both are sort of in the middle of gopher tortoise habitat, and we all want to support the military in their training missions. So there's great work going on between the military, the Department of Defense, organizations such as ours, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and other state agencies, and buffering those military bases so that wildlife can be taken care of and the military training mission can be taken care of. Threats to forest sustainability. These will probably come as no surprise to anyone in the room, but this is what we see as the primary threats: logging infrastructure, and you see the top picture there, actually a log truck, logging infrastructure with a particular emphasis on the transportation sector, whether it's driver numbers, insurability, those issues are certainly a threat we're dealing with. Forest pest and invasive species. I spent a couple of days in Savannah before heading down here earlier this past week at a southeastern regional forest insect meeting where the bug folks were in attendance from the southeastern U.S. and talking at length about what's going on there. And it was interesting. We were meeting in Savannah because we also heard from the Homeland Security folks at the Port of Savannah about how we and they are working together to try to ensure that with all of those 20-foot containers that we just heard about earlier coming into the Port of Savannah from overseas, that there's not insects and pathogens and diseases that could come in on those containers and wreak havoc on our native forest species here in the southeastern U.S., and that is an ongoing challenge. Wildfire and prescribed fire restrictions. We last couple of years we've enjoyed a pretty mild wildfire season, but we all know that can cycle in a hurry. Prescribed fire, as an agency, we're very much proponents of prescribed fire. We feel that is certainly one of the most viable, cost-effective tools in the toolbox for land managers. But again, you heard EPD yesterday talk about that they delegate to us through the permitting process a lot of the responsibility there. And if you're like me as a landowner, you maybe sometimes are frustrated when you call and try to get a burn permit and you sort of put through the ninth degree of questions, and part of what's going on there is our folks as you're talking to our folks, they're plotting smoke trajectories and looking at where that smoke is going. Really, prescribed fire has become a smoke management issue for you and us and the state. And as we tell people right now, we have a strong culture of prescribed fire in the state of Georgia. For a number of years, every year annually, the sitting governor of the state of Georgia signs a prescribed fire proclamation recognizing the benefits of prescribed fire. But if you were in here for the last session, you heard Dr. Chuck Bullock talk about the changing demographics of Georgia, the changing makeup of the legislature, and we're really only one legislative vote away from losing prescribed fire as the tool that we have. So really it's incumbent on us to manage that properly. And as we say, sometimes even if you can burn, you probably need to think, should I burn today, depending on what the smoke conditions and whatnot are and who's downwind of you. Urbanization, again, with Georgia's population growing, those folks have got to go somewhere. And you again saw the pictures earlier this afternoon about that metro Atlanta amoeba just growing and growing and growing. That's not just metro Atlanta. You can look around the Athens area where I live. You can look around Macon where our headquarters are located for the commission, Columbus, Valdosta, Albany, wherever, and you can see that those metro areas are growing. And again, that puts pressure on what has historically been timberland. Natural disasters. What more can we say about that than what we said yesterday about Hurricane Michael and sort of the lessons, if you will, very expensive lessons that Hurricane Michael taught us. I think the jury is still out on how landowners that were significantly impacted by Hurricane Michael are going to react. How are they going to manage their forest in the future? How are they going to view a 40 or 50-year-old investment on the stump that for years we've said, if you don't like timber prices now, you don't need the money now, just leave that wood on the stump. It's a safe investment and it'll sit there and continue to grow a little bit. I think Hurricane Michael sort of hit the reset button for a lot of landowners there about just being able to leave it on the stump and know that when you get up tomorrow, that investment is still going to be there and be safe. And then the last thing there probably should be at the top and probably should be in bold, and that's sustaining healthy markets. And that's something that some of you in this room have reminded us over the past couple of years as we've talked about sustainability. I think over the years the Forestry Commission in our work has tended to focus on sort of the environmental and the ecological sustainability of forestry, because really if you look at our mission as defined by the state of Georgia, it's really to help Georgia's landowners protect and conserve Georgia's forest resources. But actually some of you in the room challenged us a little bit over the past couple of years to at least revisit the issue of economic sustainability. And as we have said, healthy markets make for healthy forest. And we're not in the business at the Forestry Commission about actively recruiting mills and wood users, the way the state is structured, that task is generally relegated to the Department of Economic Development. But we and Warnell and others are there as a resource to make sure that anyone that is thinking about putting a wood using facility in Georgia has access to good solid numbers about what the wood basket is and about what those dynamics are. But I can assure you, when if Gary White, our deputy, or myself are out on the rubber chicken circuit talking to Rotary clubs around the state of Georgia, you will hear a little more from us now when we're talking about sustainability relative to markets than you probably did a few years ago. And again, that is just sort of where we are. We recognize that, and we recognize that markets in Georgia, you saw again in some earlier presentations, are not uniform around the state. You get in southeast Georgia, that is a totally different market dynamic from what you have up where Dale Green and UGA and I are located around the Athens area. And as we all know, haul distances have a lot to do with that. But again, we recognize that markets are key, and if you as landowners are going to be incentivized to keep land in timber production, that markets are key. Sometimes we get a little further out than that, and an example is when Governor Deal called the legislature into special session back in November in the wake of Hurricane Michael, and really the state stepped up and in an unprecedented way put forth about $250 million in a relief package for agriculture and forestry, most of that focused on forestry. The governor and the legislature, to myself, to Ag Commissioner Black, to the Georgia Development Authority, the folks, the Department of Revenue that were administering those programs, the message we got was very loud and clear. We're doing this because we want to keep forest in forest. And that really was sort of the driving motivation behind the legislation that was put together and the rulemaking that followed that subsequently. And Governor Deal and the legislature were very clear that we recognize that for a lot of the communities that were hit so hard by Hurricane Michael, forestry is a key part of their local economy. And for a lot of reasons, ecological, environmental, economic, we want to see forests stay in forests. So we probably got a little further out on the limb maybe than we would normally do there in structuring these programs. But again, we take our marching orders from the governor and the legislature, and they made it very clear where they were with us on that. So what's next? This document, as I mentioned, that is available to you, is a specialized document designed really to meet that obligation to inform the governor and the legislature on an every 5-year basis where we stand. It's not, in some ways, maybe it would be in this room, but in the greater general public of Georgia, it maybe really is a little bit overly technical and not very readable to some of the audience we would like to interact with. So we've got an effort we're working on now that is closing in on fruition, working with GFA and SFI to really put this in sort of a story format where it will incorporate landowner stories and sort of things that the general public can relate to, if you will, a little beyond the technical aspects of this. So you can look for that in the coming months, and we will look forward to sharing that with you. I think we all, it's a responsibility all of us have, is to look for those opportunities to implement strategies to mitigate forest threats. And again, those threats are broad and vast. It's everything from wildfire and insects and disease to just lack of public understanding, lack of political support in the changing times that we find ourselves in. So I think that we need to always be looking for those opportunities. And something that really applies to everything we do, whether it's talking about forest sustainability or whatever the subject is, and that's to talk to each other, with partnerships being the key. And as I look around this room, I see a number of our partners. I see NGOs, the Conservation Fund, the Nature Conservancy, the Georgia Conservancy. I see our friends here from NRCS at USDA that we work closely with in supporting landowners, certainly Dale Green and the folks at Warren, just a number of groups that come together. And I guess that probably has been one of my steeper learning curves since I joined the commission 2 years ago, coming in from the outside. Was I don't know that I was prepared for or understood how we as a state agency don't really do anything on our own. For us, it is all about partnerships, whether that's funding partnerships, whether that's cooperative partnerships, or whatever. And I really do embrace that and want to thank each of you in here that partner with us in any way, and certainly GFA is one of our key partners. Want to thank you for partnering with us from that standpoint.